Okay, so piece of advice from a YouTube stranger. If you decide to make a YouTube channel, your first video should not be a thesis statement that becomes a series retrospective, because what's going to happen is you're going to have a project that is 5 hours long, and then your terrible 3-in-1 computer that's just an all-in-one, doesn't have the ability to export it. So, hopefully, maybe, this will be divided into 2 parts. So if you're willing to stay with me, there will be a part 1 that I'm hoping, unless things go very wrong, is a retrospective on the first 3 games, and then the last one will be Veilguard and a wrap-up of this whole ridiculous thing. So, thank you for listening to me ramble. On with the video. Okay, intro, rewrite 5, recording 5. Let's see if it sticks this time. As I rolled credits on Dragon Age the Veilguard, I sat in the mixed feelings I had for the game and allowed the experience to wash over me. I had enjoyed quite a few aspects of the game, and I'd also felt they'd wrapped up things fairly well with its ending, or well enough that I could be mostly satisfied with this ending chapter of Dragon Age. I would even say I was fulfilled with the game and the characters I'd come to love and appreciate along the way. But as I watched those names roll by, what I found myself focused on was what the game wasn't, rather than what it was. This was not, however, an experience that was foreign to me playing a Dragon Age game. As I booted back up the game to experience the other endings, an idea began to percolate within me, an answer for a question I'd had just beneath the surface throughout the entire replay of the series I'd done before the game's release. And if I was honest with myself, for all the long and complicated years I'd followed the series. I let myself sit in these thoughts for about a week before going onto the internet to see what the reception of the game was, so that I could see other opinions and compare and contrast them with my own. What I instead saw was an absolutely volatile environment where any nuance was stripped from the discussion. This wasn't necessarily a surprise to me. Bioware games have always garnered the attention of reactionary people, often right-wing in their beliefs, going back to its origins, and becoming especially prevalent in the age of Mass Effect.
And here's how they're seeing women. They're seeing them as these objects of desire, as these, hot bodies. I mean, they don't show women as being valued for anything other than their sexuality. And it's a man in this game deciding how many women he wants to be with.
All right, let's get Jeff in on this.
That's
go ahead, Jeff.
completely incorrect. Yeah, it's completely incorrect. First of all, you can actually play as a man or a woman in the game. Cooper, have you ever played Mass Effect?
No.
That said, the sheer volume of it here on YouTube was and is stunning. To this day, if you use YouTube's awful search function to find content for Veilguard, you'll see nothing but inflammatory videos in the search bar, most of which were made by one man. Truthfully, I was never very worried about public perception. I had my own mind and I'd make it up myself, and I'd been through enough cycles of these kinds of games Bioware puts out to know that there would be backlash from the usual actors. This same reaction happened when Baldur's Gate 3 came out, but in that case the game's success was so wild that such anti-woke criticisms never left their specific echo chambers. For Veilguard, a combination of its AAA status and its constant changing nature assured it couldn't be so easily protected, even if it was perfect, which it is certainly not. In Veilguard's case, the combination of its lackluster reveal and it coming from a company that has a decade-long list of failures and mistakes meant any criticism was going to be amplified 1,000-fold, meaning the front page of the game was always going to be...
What would I rate my experience in the game so far? I would say between a 6 and a 7.
all that. This reaction was always going to happen no matter what, so that doesn't necessarily bother me. No, I think what surprised me was the reaction inside the Dragon Age fanbase. I found fairly quickly that nuanced opinions on the game were lacking, to say the least. This frustrated me, as I'm fairly active inside the Dragon Age community, and I had wrongly assumed we all had a similar idea of what Dragon Age was. I've been with the series nearly since the beginning. I picked up Origins in a GameStop bin about 6 months after release. I lived through every single release, and I'd unfortunately been a Bioware girly since I got a hand-me-down original Xbox and a copy of Knights of the Old Republic. I've watched Bioware evolve. I've watched other companies see and reflect the brilliance of how they approach their RPGs. So I feel like I've watched the birth of a companion-based subgenre that many copy elements from, but few fully emulate. It's one strongly built off of the heavy choice-based stories of CRPGs, and, equally, the companion-driven and focused JRPG subgenre. But it's also evolved to put such a heavy emphasis on the game revolving around the characters you have along with you and how you interact with them, that I feel it's become an entity all its own. Dragon Age, in my humble opinion, is the epitome of that formula. When I first sat down to write the script for this video, it wasn't what it has become. If I'm truthful, it started slightly out of spite, but it quickly turned into a passion project. Through the long course of making this video, it has changed quite a lot, had extensive rewrites, almost been thrown out multiple times, had entire edited segments thrown in the trash, and led me to both the truest version of this video I wanted to make, as well as a level of self-realization as to why I have such strong feelings about Veilguard, how it personally affected me, and why I'm so strangely obsessed by my wish to add nuance to the conversation around it. If I'm being honest with myself, there's a part of me that doesn't want to release this video. One of the last things I want to do is criticize Dragon Age on the internet, especially considering recent events. It's a series I love, and the vitriol that has surrounded Veilguard makes me want to do anything except put an emphasis on the game's flaws, an issue I tossed and turned with more than you might think through this process. I'm also not sure I'm the best person in the world to make arguments about gameplay, but as I got farther and farther into the script, it became very clear that in order to present my argument, I'd have to present counter-arguments. I'd have to present the series in both its most positive and negative light in order to do right by the thesis statement that got me here. That was not an easy thing for me to do, as my personal connection to the series complicated my conclusions, and that too was something I had to counter and also come to accept. Even if I prove an imperfect messenger, I feel a reflection is needed on this series I love so much, so that we can understand what came before without the tinted lenses of nostalgia, and truly, honestly examine the most common complaint that fans of the series have levied against Veilguard. In essence, what follows is a complicated attempt to quantify a conversation I'm fascinated by. A question that even the most devoted Dragon Age fans often disagree on. A question that has caused me to do a lot of soul-searching, and a question that has followed this series pretty much since its inception. One that gets more and more complicated to answer with every single new release. A couple of notes before we begin, the first and foremost being, this is not a Veilguard hate video. If you're looking for an unnuanced hate of the game, you're not going to find it here. You can find that pretty much anywhere else on YouTube. In fact, part of the reason I'm making this video is to show that Veilguard is not the knife in the back of the series that people pretend it is. So nuance here is key. I do not, in fact, however, advise you to go buy Veilguard. In fact, I advise the opposite. I will never give Bioware another dollar of my money again. After the events of January, I think it has become exceedingly clear that they cannot be trusted with my dollar. I might have fondness in my mixed feelings for Veilguard, however that fondness does not extend to Bioware. it extends to the people that made the game, despite everything they had to go through. Therefore, I would be a hypocrite if I even suggested you give anything to Bioware now or ever again. Next, I will be speaking negatively about every game in the series, especially post-Origins. I do have a tremendous love of the series, however, for the greater point of this video, I do have to point out each of their flaws. I will, however, do my best to balance negatives with positives, as I do feel every game has merit. Next, this is not a review of the series. My views on the games are not necessarily reflective of the quality so much as the differences in each game and what each game does not well. The point here is the wild differences, not so much my gripes with them. I do not claim to be unbiased in my view of each game, however my bias does not impede on the greater point. I have attempted to avoid major spoilers throughout this video, however I cannot promise that various footage will not in some way spoil you. So please, if you have not played the series, which I do highly advise you play the series, if you haven't played the series, I would go into this very carefully or not at all. Finally, last point. You will hear me stuffed up in this video. I have allergies, and if I don't push through the allergies at some point, I'll put this out a year after I started making it. I'm sorry, you're just gonna have to work with me here. But that's all of my notes. Let us begin this needlessly long examination. Dragon Age is my favorite gaming series of all time. I love its characters, stirring in a way that is not matched by any other series for me, all imbued with that Bioware feel I love so much, without the shackles of the morality systems used by its in-office contemporaries. I love its world as it stands uncontested as my favorite fantasy setting. Thedas is a striking world, a world that forces you to engage, a world where a neutral opinion cannot exist, and I find that fascinating. That fascination is truly helped by how the games are generally set up, forcing you to interact and exact change on that fascinating world you will inevitably have strong opinions on. It is a beautiful, thought-provoking setting, and one I return to time and time again. Despite that, however, when you look at the history of what Bioware has done when approaching Dragon Age, the first issue that pops up is rather glaring. Identity, I think, is a fantastic marketing tool. When you know exactly what you're getting when you buy a product, you're never going to be entirely disappointed by what you get. Innovation is ideal, but when you master a formula you built for the atmosphere, tone, and feel of what you're presenting, most are going to be satisfied by what you offer. Now, stagnation is a danger in any franchise, but if you go out and buy a Pokemon game, for example, you know pretty much what you're going to get. Gym badges, Elite Four, and new and old Pokemon alike. The driving factor of Pokemon games aren't the games, it's the new Pokemon you meet along the way. That's an assumed expectation. That's nearly 30 years of solidified identity. On a far closer note to Dragon Age, Mass Effect is a fantastic example of knowing your atmosphere, tone, and feel. Mass Effect is a military sci-fi. It's built off of its world and the heavy burden of command and the slow build to all-out war. Its gameplay matches that, focusing on the soldiers by your side and offering a level of combat to match the tone, until the war officially comes and culminates all of these strands of conflicts in order to unite those you fought for and face the end times together, as the only person that not only saw it coming, but also warned of this looming threat. The Mass Effect trilogy, even through the massive changes between the first and second game, and the minor ones between the second and third, largely stay the same in terms of identity between, because the Bioware identity of companions being the core of the experience, combined with the weight of the world on Shepard's shoulders, drive the story to its very end. It's the vividness of the sci-fi world, as well as the unified story and similar gameplay that gives it that identity. You know exactly what to expect when you pick up Mass Effect. Now, a good example of the opposite of this can be found in the Jak series from Naughty Dog in the 2000s. It's a series I remembered fondly and replayed last year. Upon a replay, however, it becomes clear that the identity of the series is a bit of a wash. The first game is a fairly innovative platformer with one of the first nearly load-screen-free environments in 3D gaming history. But it's also a fairly simple take on a world that the creators, at least, felt lacked a certain defining characteristic. As Jak stood in stark contrast to the more mature games that were coming out at the time, Naughty Dog felt a change was necessary. Jak 2 takes a sharp turn away from what it had previously been, instead choosing to take this fantasy setting and create a game with the same basic structure as Grand Theft Auto, but for a young teen audience. To their credit, this is handled rather cleverly in the overall story. However, to the average audience, this change was a shocking event. While the series as a whole kept to this change, sales dipped heavily between the first and second game. As a result of an attempt to chase a trend, much of those who followed the series previously were turned off by it. I can attest that, despite really loving the series as a kid, my sister could never make herself play the second or third game. She's one of those that lost all interest with the change. Interestingly, however, if you find the remnants of the oft-forgotten series online, you'll find debate amongst its fans as to which version was the best. While the external reviews of the series and the sales were very clear that the first game was best, internal debate amongst fans raged as to whether the move was smart or not. Many greatly appreciated the edge that the newer games brought, and liked how Jak went from a silent protagonist to a fully realized character. For many, the series was also an on-ramp for the design it heavily borrowed from in Rockstar's games, and is fondly remembered for that. Many will contend that the writing for the series and the characters greatly improved the feel of the setting and made it wholly unique, and it's hard to argue Jak 2 didn't do that. Most importantly, those that would have never picked up the series saw the cover and the GTA/sci-fi combination with that little bit of edge, and picked it up when they never would have picked up the original, thus creating a new audience. Jak is an interesting example to look at, as no series has ever made a hard about-face like it did, and I have a suspicion that if it hadn't, the audience for this game would be even smaller 20 years later. Despite the sales dropping with the change, the series lives on in a way that it wouldn't have if they had not taken that chance. So in the Jak series, we learn that big swings and changes can both financially hurt a series, but also foster an entirely new audience. History, perhaps, has been kinder to the change than the climate was during the PS2 era, but it's hard to deny that fans of the series are divided in what they personally prefer in hindsight. That legacy, I think, is an interesting lens to view the concept of radical change in a series by, which segues us well into Dragon Age Origins was released on November 3rd, 2009. That date, however, belies its true production cycle. While the game was released 2 years after Bioware's big next-gen success in Mass Effect, this was not a game put together in 2 years in order to have a second successful franchise to run alongside their new trilogy. The roots of Origins dates back before Mass Effect was even in production. Indeed, it dates back before Mass Effect was even an idea. In order to understand Origins, and by extension Dragon Age's place in Bioware history, we have to go back to the turn of the century. In order to understand, we have to know Bioware and its history. Bioware's story would be hard to chart without the successful IPs they were able to work within in their early years. Early members of Bioware were very passionate about RPGs as a whole, and as it happened, their first project in Shattered Steel led them to work closely with Interplay as a publisher, a juggernaut in the CRPG scene, responsible for such hits as Alone in the Dark and Fallout. After showing Interplay a demo for their new RPG, Interplay suggested that Bioware seek out the license for Dungeons & Dragons. And with that, the Baldur's Gate series was born, and Bioware was catapulted into the upper echelons of RPG studios to watch. The success of the game also allowed Bioware to win the lauded rights to make a Star Wars game in 2000, a license that would eventually lead to the smash hit Knights of the Old Republic. Their success was impressive, with each game earning high sales and great reviews. But that success did come with an issue that grew more troublesome by the year. Bioware was largely reliant on outside forces in order to survive. Interplay as a publisher, who had been critical in getting them these licenses, were on shaky grounds in terms of their financial stability, and would soon go out of business, and legal disputes between the two companies assured that even if they had survived, they wouldn't have been any help regardless. The properties they helped Bioware land in Star Wars and Dungeons & Dragons were lucrative, but like their previous relationship with Interplay, Bioware would always be reliant on outside sources being on good terms with them in order to have a basis of financial success. What also wasn't helpful was the loss of the D&D license, thus stalemating any chance of continuing the BG series. Due to this, in the early 2000s, Bioware began a long journey to create their own IPs that could take the unique RPG experience they had fostered and put it under something they owned themselves. One of those earliest projects, despite being the latest to be actualized into release, was Dragon Age Origins, originally known internally as Chronicles, whose long and sordid production history began as far back as 2002. The original concept of this project was fairly simple. Create a spiritual successor to Bioware's Baldur's Gate series, set in a world they had created themselves. David Gator, who had previously cut his teeth on the second Baldur's Gate game, Neverwinter Nights and KOTOR, was asked to lead creative on the project, and thus became the lead writer and spiritual father of Dragon Age's World of Thedas, and also the most consistent face through the game's production. That original vision for Origins as the spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate in their own original world would largely remain the central pillar of the game throughout its near 8-year production. However, a combination of technology lagging behind their vision, an internal wishy-washiness on if there should be a multiplayer aspect, an issue with a lot of Bioware games going forward, led to a team from another project that had pulled out ahead of Chronicles' sordid production history, coming in to push the project towards its end days. That product was Jade Empire. Jade Empire's team spent a certain amount of time conceptualizing a sequel that ultimately turned into another project, before that project in and of itself was scrapped, leaving them to move to the Dragon Age team. Mark Dara goes into a lot of this on his YouTube channel, which I highly suggest. Dara was director on the first 3 Dragon Age games and was brought back as an independent contractor to give advice on Veilguard as well. As a side note, I highly recommend his content, largely because I think there's a tremendous deficit in the understanding of game development on YouTube, and I think someone with the level of Mark Dara's experience, or as another example, Fallout creator Tim Kaine, should get as much attention as possible, because their experiences can help foster a better vocabulary and understanding of the gaming industry than we currently have on YouTube. Which, by the way, I am not exempt from this issue. I feel I am constantly just struggling to find words to describe gameplay, so please don't take this as a superior tone. I'm learning as I go, and I think resources like Dara and Tim Kaine are an important teacher in that respect. I do not know what this video would look like without Dara's work. Back on point, these team members from Jade Empire were divided between Dragon Age and Mass Effect, with many of the leads such as Mike Laidlaw and Mark Dara himself specifically going to Dragon Age. Originally, these leads were asked to conceptualize Dragon Age 2, and that time they had before joining the Origins team would allow them to make a roadmap for the series past DA2. While they were working on this, however, Origins executive producer Dan Tudge left the company, leaving the project in April 2009, 6 months before release. Dara was made new executive producer, and his team was asked to come in and watch over the last days of the project. The groundwork of the game and much of the production had already been done by this point under Dan Tudge's leadership, so all that was left was simply finalizing as much of it as they could, unifying the vision of the project, and making some changes EA requested. More on that later. This unified push to finish the game finally got Dragon Age onto store shelves during holiday 2009. All bias on the table, Dragon Age Origins is one of my favorite games of all time. It usually sits second for me, but in terms of both emotional attachment and respect for the project, it's a strong contender for first. The sheer volume of tools it offers you in creating a vast array of your own unique characters, its deeply impressive breadth of choice, and its well-defined, bold world building with a wealth of political depth, combined to create a game, a world, a story that has not been duplicated for me. It also helps that Origins was perhaps the biggest game myself and my mom had in common, which is an incredibly important aspect of not just this game to me, but the series as a whole, and as you'll see, this video. There is, admittedly, some sentimentality that comes with this game for me. That bias aside, however, it's hard to argue that the legacy of Origins doesn't stand on its own outside of my particular sentimentality. Its roleplay mechanics are perhaps the deepest of any game I've ever played, allowing you to pick from multiple origins with all of the world-building aspects that come with each, and build a character with truly unique outlooks on the decisions you'll make along the way, built on the wealth of world-building and choice present in the game and the setting. These origins are literal origins, as each offers you a prologue that is unique to your specific choices, an accomplishment that likely cannot nor will ever be duplicated. Its tone and atmosphere is often lauded, and even if that is sometimes weaponized against the other games in the series, for this project specifically, it's a fantastic way to give weight to everything you do, thus unifying the project to have a cohesive feel. As someone who sometimes finds dark fantasy to equate with a level of brutalism and shallow readings of the genre it exists within, that's akin to a snake eating its tail, I think Origins does the dark fantasy concept in a way many of its contemporaries failed to do. The dark fantasy aspects of the game are there to create three-dimensional characters that you can understand the actions of, regardless of the morality of those choices. It doesn't fall into the trap of explaining away or romanticizing horrid actions like many dark fantasy deconstructions do, but it assures that the depth of its characterizations makes you understand even the most heinous actions perpetrated, while also not attempting to forgive them within the narrative. The tone is there to add to characterization and to critique its own world building. That dedication to grimdark, however, does come with several criticisms. While it largely does avoid the issues I have with brutalism for brutalism's sake, there are moments where the game will lean into unnecessary shock in its lore in order to create horror, and while that horror can be effective, the means don't necessarily justify the ends. On that same note, Origin's core greatest issue is how it treats its women. The worst aspects of this are several arcs over reliance on Assault, particularly SA, in order to tell their stories. It's overdone in this game to an archaic extent, and in many ways the rest of the series spends its time attempting to undo some of the damage that those particular choices caused. This is perhaps the most emblematic example of Origins and the time period it was created within, an aspect that plagued the fantasy genre as a whole at the time, and that choice harms several well-written arcs' quality, simply due to its overuse. While this callous treatment of women's trauma does haunt the narrative, I do feel it's largely avoided in its major characters, with one massive and, quite frankly, constantly aging like milk exception. This issue is still ultimately an extremely noticeable flaw in the game's writing. While the issue can, in many cases, be overcome by the main female cast, the side characters are a different story. The non-essential NPC women tend to be one-note caricatures that are often there merely to be an object of desire. This view also extends into queer representation, something the game attempts to put forward repeatedly, but stumbles with as much as they succeed. Still, I think this is an issue that is largely overcome, and Origins handles it likely better than many of its aged contemporaries. While some parts of this game's narrative, the world, and lore all aged poorly, the strong world building combined with slight tweaks to the lore as the series continues tends to iron out these issues. One of the reasons the series is able to so easily rebound from these early and glaring mistakes is because of how well the world and its lore is written and presented. This is especially shown in the game's codexes, which are, throughout the series, carefully written like a history book in the real world, to be taken with a grain of salt based on, often religious, biases of history. This history is written by the Chantry, a deeply flawed organization written with clear criticisms of the history of Christianity and the Crusades. Human colonialism and expansionism is also explored through this same lens, as the elven people of Thedas are a divided people. The Dalish are small clans of elves constantly on the move in order to avoid the hostile humans that dominate the continent, and are dedicated to finding and retaining their own history, destroyed and lost to time. On the other hand, the city elves exist among humans and are seen as second-class citizens, segregated by humans to alienages, their own poorly kept sections of the city, constantly taken advantage of by the humans that abuse them. These issues with Chantry cultural control specifically is not limited to how it interacts with just the elves, as their deep-seated belief in the dangers of magic led to the mage circles, corrupt, unethical institutions that segregate anyone found to have the touch of magic inside institutions that largely isolate and cage them away from the rest of the population. Left under the paranoid eye of the Templars, Chantry-backed soldiers raised to fight magic and hopelessly tied to the addictive substance of lyrium in order to be leashed and collared by the Chantry themselves. My personal favorite aspect of the world is the Dwarven people, the only people in Thedas that seem completely disconnected from magic, so much so that they cannot even dream. Originally spread across a vast network of deep roads that cross all over Thedas as a continent, the dwarves have lost these grand roads in their civilization to the Darkspawn, living beings imbued with the Blight, robbed of their minds and twisted by the disease until they only understand the calling of blighted gods, who rise once every few generations under the command of blighted god dragons to force them to expand like locusts and inflict the blight on the world. The dwarves of Orzammar are the only people that deal with them constantly outside of these blights, and are dying due to both their constant attacks and the loss of their full empire. And yet, despite their dwindling numbers, they are self-inflicted victims of an overbearing caste system that limits their people. Any dwarves that leave their underground haven of Orzammar are excommunicated from their society, never to be able to return, as if tainted by the sun. Dwarven culture even goes so far as to exclude criminals and their ancestors into a casteless class that are segregated and forgotten to their own history, only furthering their downfall into oblivion. The only seeming hope against these Darkspawn and their blights are the Grey Wardens, a greatly misunderstood and secretive organization dedicated to the defeat of the blights, and yet tight-lipped about how exactly they specifically can defeat the blights and the archdemons that lead them. They take from princes and prisoners alike, turning none away who are willing to raise a blade and die fighting the blight. These deeply political issues follow you throughout the entirety of the game, and you're forced to confront each of them to varying extents in order to garner aid for the oncoming blight. You're forced to choose a side between the mages and Templars, you're forced to alter the position of the Dwarven throne, and most notably, you're forced to deal with the political ramifications of the betrayal you suffer at the start of the game, and how that threatens a nationwide civil war. These political struggles not only serve as hurdles for you to overcome through a wide array of options from the kind to the cruel and everything in between, but they also serve as a fantastic primer for the world of Thedas itself. I adore these aspects of Thedas and its world building. It is such a rich foundation that the rest of the series builds upon. But it does have glaring racist overtones, an unfortunately common issue in the fantasy genre as a whole. The Blight, right at the forefront, mirrors the classic fantasy pitfall of faceless, demonized foreign usurpers. The Jaelish are very much inspired by indigenous peoples, an issue mirrored by the City Elves and their cultural assimilation to the Chantry, segregated by that same society. This issue worsens when you consider how their gods are handled throughout the series. It's not good. One would say it's not good. It's very bad. Actually, it's not good. Very bad. Gang, it's not good. It's really not good, gang. And this issue worsens when you consider how culturally off limits the Chantry is in terms of expanding the lore. So, oh, god damn it. And yet, somehow, someway, even more than that, probably the most questionable addition to Thetis' lore is the Qun, as it is very much meant to resemble Muslim and Arabic culture, and are repeatedly othered and seen as dogmatic and worse than even the Chantry, an organization repeatedly explored as being corrupt and harmful in the games themselves, but never fully demonized like the Qun is at every turn. The Qun is handled differently in every game, and to give a modicum of fairness, I think the writers try to handle it with more nuance each and every game, but somehow they make it worse every single time. It's an issue so bad that the common consensus is that Dragon Age 2 handles it best, but god, if that's the case, that is grim. The writing of the Qun is an emblematic cultural artifact of when Origins was made in a post-9/11 2000s. And perhaps it shows how little we've progressed that it is also the lingering issue of the series. I say none of this to rag or dismiss Thetis, as it's still my personal favorite fantasy setting. However, I feel it's important to highlight these issues very early on, and solidify it as a series-wide set of issues and not just one that suddenly took a turn deeper in the franchise. I will contend, however, that despite its issues, Thetis is a fantastic example of a setting very much built off of making you care deeply, not for its magic or its massive, powerful characters, but instead for its central political struggles. Investment is Thetis' most powerful tool, as you cannot have a neutral opinion of its world after diving into it. Thetis' world building, largely thanks to Gator and his work, is both deeply fascinating, politically stirring, and deeply critical of not just itself, but our world as a whole. That world building has served as an anchor of storytelling throughout the series' complicated history. At the same time, Dragon Age Origins is funny.
I never dreamed I would ever lay my eyes on the urn of sacred ashes. I have no words to express.
I could not have asked for a greater honor than to be here. I will never forget this feeling.
Congratulations, you found a waste bin.
Often dark fantasy catches itself up in this vortex of impenetrable seriousness. Dragon Age Origins is certainly not that. One of the key aspects of Bioware's storytelling as a whole, especially in the age of Dragon Age and Mass Effect, is choice. Heart-wrenching choices, calculated choices, biased choices, choices by which the world hinges on, and choices you might see the consequences of years later in another game. These are all core values people look for in their releases. Origins offers choice in spades, from the small, such as choosing if you'll help a young dwarven girl pursue her dreams of learning magic, at the cost of losing her caste, her father, and everything she ever knew. It excels in massive choices, deciding the fate of 2 different monarchies throughout the game, and those choices both come with not only political ramifications, but a slew of consequences and tough decisions that impact those around you. The balance of pragmatism, morality, and emotional attachment in friends, and hatred for those that hurt you, lead to a multitude of options before you to make. Choice comes in such spades that you can even make extremely petty choices, such as poisoning a limited font of miraculous healing simply because it's the ashes of a woman that represents the chantry that harms so many. As is true with any Bioware outing, the heart of the game still exists within the companions that join you along the way. Now, it's debatable if this is a biased statement, and probably dependent on your tastes, but this might be my favorite of all the companion groups in Bioware's history. The core four of this party, all romanceable options, are absolutely excellent characters. There's Zevran, an assassin who takes a contract from the main villain in order to specifically kill you. In his perhaps self-chosen failure, you have the choice to spare him and take him either under your protection or threatening command. And through that path you discover the horrors he had to experience growing up, sold at a young age to the legendary shadowy assassination sect known as the Antivan Crows, and the difficult upbringing he had to endure simply to survive that lifestyle at a young age, a traumatic past Zevran himself seems ill-equipped to recognize for what it truly was. An incredibly flirtatious man who is simultaneously deeply guarded and repressed with his emotions, Zevran's journey allows him to confront the trauma of his past decisions and the context in which they were made, and takes him closer to a path of self-realization where he can find peace with himself, who he is, and the value of his own life outside the circumstances of his childhood.
To be truthful, I didn't even know the Crows existed when I joined them. I was but a boy of 7 when I was purchased, for 3 sovereigns, I'm told, which is a good price, considering I was all ribs and bone and didn't know the pommel of a dagger from the pointy end. The Crows buy all their assassins that way, buy them young, raise them to know nothing else but murder, and if you do poorly in your training, you die. In Antiva, being a Crow gets you respect, it gets you wealth, gets you women, and men. Or whatever it is you might fancy. But that does not mean doing what is expected of you always. And it means being expendable. It's a cage, if a gilded cage. Pretty, but confining.
Next there's Liliana, a seemingly innocent Chantry sister whose request to join you comes with the belief that she has received a vision from the Chantry's god figure, the maker of the oncoming blight, and believes she herself has been divinely tasked with aiding you. Whether this was a misinterpreted dream, a lie she told herself, or a genuine vision from something beyond possible comprehension, this Chantry sister is quickly revealed to be much more than she appears, as her history as a bard of the Orlesian court begins to interweave with her journey, bringing to light her tale of serving as a spy and sometimes assassin, and the betrayals that led her to the service of the Maker, and what all of these experiences mean for who she is now and who she could be in the future.
Do you want to know a secret? That moment I keep, because even now, I don't know what ending serves best. But being able to choose, that is the truth of this story. The rest, it changes with the audience. All things change when they find purpose. In your heart shall burn an unquenchable flame.
There's also Alistair, a former Templar turned recruited Grey Warden, a seemingly well-humored person that joined the Warden shortly before your character, and also becomes the only other Warden that survives the betrayal that opens the main part of the game. Faced with grief for what he felt was the only true family he'd ever had being wiped out, Alistair chooses to continually give up his seniority to a younger recruit. He's a man who fears leadership and responsibility, and combats his own insecurities with deflective humor, largely as a coping mechanism for his true upbringing. A bastard of a royal line whose royalty has only ever hurt him. Responsibility is a curse that has both been hefted on him and denied him his entire life, and leadership is the shadow of that contradictory trauma, a fear he has attempted to bat away in 1,000 different ways but continually fails to outrun.
There's been so much death and destruction. It makes me feel good that at least we were able to save something, no matter how small. I owed the Arl that much. You're right. Hopefully, by that time, there's still enough of Ferelden left to save. Good. Now that the warm, fuzzy part of the day is over with, we can get back to the ritual dismemberments. Oh wait, it's not Tuesday, is it?
Finally, there's arguably one of, if not the, mascot of the series, Morrigan, the Witch of the Wilds. Morrigan is a self-assured, if very young woman of mysterious origins, who joins the group from the hut in which her mother Flemeth raised her. This upbringing largely hid her from the world, a world her mother curtailed her from truly engaging with, largely through cruelty and multiple layers of abuse and grooming. Agency is something Morrigan has never had while within the clutches of her mother, and it's ultimately her mother that pushes her out into the world. Morrigan is outwardly sarcastic, often cruel, and holds deeply cynical and dark views of the world, but this attitude and her worldview are largely crafted from how she was raised and who her mother wanted her to be. Now she stands as an incredibly powerful mage in her own right, but one that still cannot outrun the shadow of her mother she stands within. Knowingly or unknowingly, she carries the lessons her mother bred into her bone through abuse as core values, and that core value also comes with a level of secrecy that greatly affects your character and Morrigan's own fate.
I am aware that I have little talent for forming friendships, to put it lightly. 'Tis something I know nothing of, nor ever thought I needed. But friendship, of all the things I could have imagined when Flemeth told me to go with you, this would be the very last. I want you to know that while I may not always prove worthy of your friendship, I will always value it. But enough of such idle talk. There are more useful things to be done, surely.
Yeah, I play favorites, so what? I told you I'm biased. In the debate for the best character in the entire series, all 4 of these characters are in heavy contention. That is a feat that has not been replicated by the series. But if you want my incredibly biased opinion, it's Liliana or Morrigan, and it's not even close, because Liliana has the best multi-game character arc in the entire series, and Morrigan is, well, I'm biased, but maybe my favorite fictional character of all time. The layers! But it doesn't end there. More companions join your party, each offering different views of the world and different conflicts both interpersonally and within the confines of the world. Sten struggles to understand a society that is so outside the Qun, the code he grew up within, while also being poked and prodded to explain deep concepts that he's known since birth, as if such a thing was so easy, all while struggling to know if he can ever go home again. Wynne faces the end of her life and attempts to spend the last of her days doing something that truly matters, while also struggling with the acceptance of that coming end. Shale awakens with confused and broken memories from eons as a golem, a built dwarven metal construct, angry at every organic for what one did to them, and is faced with the truth of where they come from. And seriously, Shale's existential reality being hidden behind dry wit and disassociation should put them more heavily into the category of best companions. We need to have a proper conversation about them because they're one of the best in the series. You have a dog and he's the bestest boy to ever live. You saved him from the plague that you also have, and therefore he serves as an example of what can be if you overcome the blight. Oghren exists! Anyway, I could go into more detail on the game here, and the specific decisions or the villains, but I don't want this section to be me gushing over the game any more than I already have. Believe me when I say it's taking a tremendous effort not to talk about Awakening here, because oh my god, it's so good. Yes, I felt the need to point out the foundational issues with the game and its setting, but also I wanted to point out some of its greatest strengths, because they're central reasons why this game is so beloved, and should be highlighted as being representative in what Dragon Age was in its first outing. It's a game that resonates for a reason, and arguably the peak of the Bioware format that came before the advent of Mass Effect. It's a formula Baldur's Gate 3 would later emulate and build upon, creating perhaps the best game of the 2020s. When you look at Baldur's Gate 3, it's just as much the spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate as it is heavily inspired by the other spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate in Dragon Age Origins. Many of the more party-based mechanics in terms of getting to know your companions are largely taken directly from Origins over Baldur's Gate, and that speaks very flatteringly of what Origins was able to accomplish. There is, however, an aspect of Origins that I think is often overlooked, one that is largely emblematic of what would come for the franchise after its release. It's a topic that's largely ignored or dismissed as unimportant that I've rarely seen people outside of the Dragon Age team talk about, and that is the console port. Origins is beloved by a large group that adores its combat. As an overhead TAC-cam-based CRPG, it offers incredible versatility. It's tactically interesting and as deep as you want to make it. It blends the previous combat of games like Baldur's Gate and evolves it for a new generation, finding a bridge from a more turn-based system and blending it with real-time aspects. Innovation that still offers a level of tactical control not seen in its contemporaries until the rebirth of the CRPG half a decade later. That beloved aspect, however, was not a universal experience. I've always been a console gamer. I don't have, nor have I ever had the money to sink into a good computer, and if you could see how my computer suffers just running DaVinci Resolve, you'd be shocked I got any of this done at all. Even without that limitation, however, frankly, I enjoy the experience of sitting on a lounge chair and playing a game on controller far, far more than sitting upright at a desk playing a game with mouse and keyboard. That means the vast majority of playthroughs I've done of Dragon Age Origins have been on console. The console port of Origins came very late in the development process, largely due to requests from EA. EA, after all, had just acquired Bioware as Dragon Age Origins production started to wind down. Origins was the last of the company's projects to be solely for PC, but by this point Bioware was more successful in terms of sales on the console front. Because Origins was so specialized for PC, it was extremely difficult to refit its full capabilities to purely work on controller, and nearly impossible to do in the 6 months they had before the game's release. The console port was largely outsourced to Edge of Reality, who did the best they could with reconfiguring the entire game to both run on the less powerful consoles and actually have its own controller setup. It was entirely impractical to take the handcrafted deep PC TAC-cam-based gameplay of Origins and make it work on console, so the Edge of Reality team instead opted to rework it as much as possible. The console version of Origins actually more closely resembles Knights of the Old Republic than it does its own namesake. While the UI is different, it plays very similarly to the pausable quickbar system that one would have seen on the original Xbox. It's more streamlined, certainly, with the need for scrolling through an action bar removed in favor of face buttons for different attacks, but the actual combat is very much in real time, with a pause feature to slow down and switch between companions as is necessary to control combat scenarios. A radio menu was added in order to keep the range of options the PC version offered, at the very least open to the player in combat, however it was quite clunky to use in practice. The game incentivized you to pick 4 to 6 attacks, tie them to buttons, and use them in nearly every combat, stripping down a wide array of options to just 6, mindlessly clicking them until cooldowns ended. Now, it certainly helps that you're able to freely switch between your companions, however they also are greatly limited by this same exact issue. Add to that switching between party members is harder to manage in the much more action-based real-time console version than it is in the highly controlled, set-your-own-pace gameplay of the PC port, and you have a game that plays far, far more simply than the proper PC version. When you look at the difference between Origins on console and PC, you might simply shrug your shoulders. It was a poor console port, those happen all the time. The problem occurs when you realize that Bioware and EA's focus was quickly shifting from PC to console, where most of their success was. After all, it was better to reach as many players as possible instead of only presenting to one market, even if that plan conflicted with the design of the original game. And that direction would be important for the franchise going forward. Since I presented my positive bias with Origins, I have to present my negative bias as well. I love Dragon Age 2. It is, perhaps, the best narrative game in the entire franchise. It's also in contention for my least favorite game in the series, for it strips many of my favorite aspects of the series away entirely. I greatly disliked it at launch, but I've softened to it quite a lot, largely because, well, frankly, I was stupid when I was younger, and many of these aspects went over my head, but also because as I've grown older, many aspects tug at my heartstrings far more than they would have when I was young. My dislike of the game and my softening toward it work in tandem, however, as the tremendous flaws of the game are greatly explained by the environment it was forced to be made in, and the oversight that assured that launch would be a minefield of poor reception. Time has been very kind to this game with that proper context in mind, and that kindness is earned as DA2 offers a story unmatched in the entire series. However, the initial reception and all of its rough edges, juxtaposed with how overlooked these negative elements are now 13 years later, begin the basis of the thesis statement of this video. As such, this is the part of the video where, by unfortunate necessity, my views of the games get a little harsher. Similar to Jak 2, Dragon Age 2 was the wildest swing in the series, and while that swing was forced rather than by developer choice, that necessity would bring a bad habit that would follow Dragon Age for the rest of its history. For all of Dragon Age 2's strengths, and it has many and we'll talk about them, it did begin the identity crisis the series has never escaped. Somewhat ironically, however, despite the numeral added to the game's title, the devs that worked on the game were always resistant to it being a mainline Dragon Age game at all. When the original dev team that eventually joined Origins to lead it through its last days sat down to plan a second game in the series, that game did not look like Dragon Age 2. It instead looked far closer to the third game that would eventually come out in the series, Dragon Age Inquisition. From the moment that the Jade Empire team integrated into the Origins team, that game was always the next step in the series as a whole. But when EA was informed that Bioware's MMO The Old Republic needed more time in the oven, EA pushed for there to be a 2011 fiscal release to replace the gap in the schedule. The Mass Effect team presumably had their hands full, a team that would also later partially fall victim to a crunch release due to EA's tactics. So it came down to the Dragon Age dev team to, as Mark Dara puts it in his Memories and Lessons video on the game, fill the gap. Dragon Age Inquisition was simply unfeasible to make in that amount of time, so something entirely new had to be made. While David Gator and Mark Dara disagree on the use of the terminology of DA2 being originally an expansion for Dragon Age Origins that became the seed for the next game, what both seem to agree on is that the very, very basic surface-level original ideas came from the seed of a post-Awakening Origins expansion that never got very far due to this hole that needed to be plugged in the schedule. Regardless of the descriptor used, the development team did have to create something entirely new out of DA2. This decision to create another Dragon Age game that was not Inquisition was the only way to keep the original vision of what would be that game intact, and would allow the team to make the best game they could with the resources they had. Several people, including Gator and Dara, have talked about how their original vision for the name of this game was Dragon Age Exodus, and that subtitle makes a lot of sense. Not only does it fit the story of an immigrant fleeing the Blight and surviving in a new, hostile environment, but it's also a title that would have sent a strong message that this was not the future Bioware had in mind for the series, but instead a side story. A very important side story, mind you, but an exodus from the atypical formula they had built in the previous game. This was a concerted effort to set expectations by the creators of the game, and I can say with a fair amount of certainty, as the 20-year-old I was at the time, who was so right about everything all the time forever, Don't judge me. We all grew up on the internet. We all had that phase. You did too. And if you didn't, you're in it now. That would have really eased my fears about the game. I was, of course, an apologist for Bioware at that age as well. For God's sakes, I defended the ME3 ending all over the internet when it first came out. It wouldn't have taken much for me to get behind it. This was, of course, blocked by higher executives, thus taking the public perception of the game being a side story rather than a main entry entirely out of the team's hands. Thus, disappointment was inevitable. Because we now have that context, Dragon Age 2 can be seen in a very different light. The mistakes of its design make a lot more sense, such as the reused assets and the claustrophobic feel. Dragon Age 2's scope is brought down from Origin's greater world to one very small city with 3 different small city section maps, plus an additional 2 winding hallway-like exteriors to the city itself. These areas have day and night options in order to offer a little variety, with night being besieged by gangs roaming the streets, which even extends to the dreary Darktown streets, where impoverished Ferelden immigrants barely scrape by living in the darkness of the rest of the city. These gangs are dealt with once per act, so they don't outstay their welcome. However, their presence is negligible outside of a quest with 0 cutscenes that nets you additional gold. They are there, essentially, to add combat outside of mission structure. Exterior areas in the Wounded Coast and the Sundermount work similarly, however there are no day and night cycles attached to them. To give credit to these outside areas, there's much more content here, stumbling across quests that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. They are still, however, mostly there just for combat. While this additional combat is far from a bad thing, how these encounters reset each act is a prime example of how assets are reused in the game, in this case arbitrarily increasing the game's length. This wouldn't be as big of an issue if these encounters were there to lead to more quests. However, the majority of quests are either delivered to you by mail or encountered in the city during the day, thus meaning that these gang nighttime encounters are there almost entirely as repeatable events to pad time. Perhaps the most memorable part of how small and claustrophobic Kirkwall feels are the reused assets. Each side quest that goes into areas outside of the main parts of the game are chosen from a series of very limited presets, each made to be an archetype of a dungeon. These archetypes always have the same structure, but are arbitrarily closed off in certain areas, with doors being shut-closed by immovable stone slabs with very little reason outside of this area is not a part of this specific quest. To be fair, this is also something that Origins does. However, Origins offers a far greater world with, for its time, a vast amount of environments to explore. These reused areas in Origins also tend to be a pit stop towards larger parts of the story, places where you spend a couple minutes, perhaps 10 minutes at most, before moving on to an actual pre-established part of the game. In Dragon Age 2, these areas come back again and again and again, often in major plot-relevant quests in the game. Now, to be fair to the game, the environment of Kirkwall is perhaps the most memorable area of Thedas in the entire series. The gallows, for example, loom menacingly over both its area and all of Kirkwall as a whole, creating an intimidating presence that matches the Templars' role within the story. The gallows, appropriately, are an ancient slave prison, now used to house the Circle of Magi, where mages are especially brutalized even by Templar standards. Hightown and Lowtown create both positive and negative visions of what Kirkwall is, while also driving home how badly the class structure hurts its denizens, and how truly, horrendously immigrants are treated. Darktown is especially horrid, a place so barren and dirty and lifeless that it's genuinely distressing to see how people survive there, entirely in the shadows, forgotten. The infrastructure and internal politics of the city are equally shown in both the Viscount's Keep and the Chantry, both set at the top of incredibly high steps, looming over Hightown to provide comfort to those helped by those organizations. However, that looming presence is only a comfort to those who live in Hightown. The Chantry can be seen from Lowtown, where people still struggle to survive, where the elven people exist in a tiny alienage hidden away in the corner, the structure of the Chantry religion barely, if at all, helpful to their entire existence. I will, however, contend that part of the reason Kirkwall is so memorable Kirkwall is the series' environmental storytelling at its best. Every single part of the city, from its darkest corners to the looming buildings above, is there as a reminder of how corrupt and broken the city is. Look up, and you'll see broken and corrupt organizations looming over your very existence. Look around, and you'll see the poverty and subjugation that structure has caused. And look down, and you'll see those that don't even have a choice at poverty, instead entrapped in a life not dissimilar to the slaves who once lived under Tevinter's thumbprint here, so long ago. Kirkwall feels oppressive, and that is by design. I will, however, contend that part of the reason Kirkwall is so memorable is less because of its design and more due to the amount of time we spend within it. Realistically, these areas are very small, and despite my praise previously, many areas lack memorable landmarks. Spending 30 to 60 hours in one cohesive area will make something far more memorable than returning to one city every handful of hours. That doesn't inherently make it a better area than the other, but it does mean that rarely visited city will inherently be given less time and care comparatively. This additional focus does make the city feel very static and claustrophobic, however. The same amount of time in one place makes one very critical of how it does and doesn't change. Emphasis on the doesn't, because Kirkwall really does not change over the course of the 7 years Dragon Age 2 is supposed to take part with it. This standstill is counterintuitive to the narrative time-lapse. A better way to approach Kirkwall without adding far too much time to the development of the game, I would contend, would be small changes to the city throughout the course of the game. A changing of the seasons, major areas having more slightly different landmarks as a consequence of what had occurred in the previous act, making the city feel as lived in as the in-world length of the game would have helped to make the environment feel less closed in and static. But Kirkwall is a character in Dragon Age 2, as important to the narrative structure as any sentient person. It's a city constantly on the verge of collapse due to the instability of its failing political structure, and further threatened by the greater geopolitical issues of Thedas at its doorstep. That collapse is told through the story structure. The game is divided up into 3 acts, each with its own contained story. While the first act is generally a very dry story of an attempted excursion into riches that might save Hawke's family from poverty, the whole of the act is also used to set up the next 2 acts, creating a through line that allows you to feel uneasy with the growing threat of the Qunari and the slow collapse of the Mage Circle through Templar brutality. When the system is effective, it's excellent, but without scrutiny it does very much appear that the game is divided between ideas. But I would contend that doesn't give the game enough credit. The through lines allow the game to build up its main players, and especially its excellent antagonists. And while some plot threads aren't handled very well, looking at you, Orsino, it's still incredibly effective at maintaining narrative cohesiveness. This mix and match of positive and negative traits are a natural symptom of the constraints DA2 was made under. It hurt many aspects of the game. However, it did also allow the Dragon Age team to create something far more unique than was possible in other entries. With the short development cycle came the need to tighten the story and its scope, and with that also came the ability to focus purely on character. Character is, of course, the appeal of any game within this RPG niche that Bioware created, and some of the most iconic characters Bioware has ever made had their start in this game. Varric Tethras serves as the storyteller of the game, an imperfect narrator telling a very carefully manicured story of Hawke and the gang's exploits to the Seeker interrogating him. This imperfect messenger aesthetic also follows him into his position throughout the story, a somewhat sarcastic presence in the party who also quietly serves as a mediator and protector of the party behind the scenes. At the core of Varric as a character is this need to believe the very best of the people around him, and that empathy being challenged is at the heart of his struggle throughout the series. His presence and tie to Hawke specifically allowed him to become such a fan favorite that he became a figurehead symbol of the series right beside the likes of Morrigan and Liliana.
What compels you to spin these ridiculous tales?
I love the sound of my own voice, and I'm a compulsive liar. Honestly, I don't know. It's just something I do. There's power in stories, though. That's all history is. best tales, the ones that last. Might as well be mine.
While Varric is the most iconic character to come out of the game in terms of legacy, the depth of his character is greatly challenged compared to the roster's cast. Fenris is a former Tevinter slave, with the wounds of his captivity so entrenched in him that it appears as these ghostly tattoos that his master inflicted on him as a perverse experiment, making him an enslaved, glorified status symbol of a sick and twisted, powerful man. With these tattoos came abilities that were used to weaponize him as a guard, and a loss of memories that leaves him knowing no life before being this enriched man's personal plaything. This deep-seated trauma manifests even after escaping both the literal shackles of slavery and the figurative shackles of what slavery did to his mind in a hatred of mages and magic. His background proves to him that no person can be trusted with the seductive power of magic, as it leads to the same lust for power at others' expenses that caused an environment like Tevinter to exist. He is at odds with the power structures that indenture others in a similar way to how he was enslaved. However, the reasoning of stopping rampant magic is enough for him to struggle to see it as the same. The pain tattooed into his skin blinds him to the pain of any that might carry a hint of the magic that burned those same lyrium-addled markings into his flesh.
I thought discovering my past would bring a sense of belonging, but I was wrong. Magic has tainted that too. There is nothing for me to reclaim. I am alone.
As an exact counterpoint to Fenris, you have Anders. Anders is a returning character from DAO's Awakening expansion, which I glossed over whilst talking about the game for time's sake. An inciting incident that occurs between the expansion and this game, the timeline is really shaky, but that's a whole different topic, we don't have time for that, is Anders' relationship with Justice, a spirit trapped in the material world, largely against his own will. In order to, in his view, save his friend, he takes that spirit of justice within him, and that spirit joining with him changed both of them forever. Anders, who had always found himself at odds with the Circle of Magi, an establishment purely built around the containment and control of mages like him, was someone who rebelled against and tried to escape from the place in multiple ways throughout his life. Once he was out of the Circle, much of his life turned to just staying away from the Templars that enforced the Circle at any cost. But beneath that need to survive was a deep-seated anger towards an institution that harmed his people, took from them their freedom, abused them while imprisoning them, and even sometimes took their very minds away from them. With Justice now one with him, that frustration boiled into a hatred, and through that hatred, Anders' attitude towards the institution went from one of escape to slowly being an internal drive toward liberation, only compounded by the specific horrors of the Kirkwall Circle. This internal battle, while justified and even rightful and necessary, is complicated by how deep that hatred goes, and slowly turns his wish for justice against the Templars into one of vengeance, further complicating his goals of liberation with his own battle for his soul and the friend he has twisted by taking him within himself.
The world needs to see this. Then we can all stop pretending the Circle is a solution. And if I pay for that with my life, then I pay. Perhaps then justice would at least be free.
Then there's Meryl. Meryl is a minor character in the Dalish origin of DAO. However, she's both reinvented while also being true to the implications of that origin here. Meryl comes from a Dalish clan that fled the Blight, one that has suffered terribly from both fleeing across the sea, as well as one that's still reeling from the loss of two of their clan to a mysterious blighted mirror without any true answer as to what it was and why it happened. Meryl, an isolated member of the clan, and yet second to the clan's leader, takes this grief especially hard, and uses it to attempt to unravel the mysteries of just such a mirror. That mystery, that singular drive to find an answer to her grief through the fixing of a dangerous artifact of her people, who have lost so much of their history, leads her down a path of isolation and obsession that forces her to leave her clan and join a human city, just to keep researching that which her clan so terribly fears in their own grief. Marrow is a brilliant student of magic and a fierce protector of the forgotten histories of her people, but through that need to protect her people, contorted through the prism of her own grief, she has chosen to embrace blood magic, a method of magic whom many turn their nose up to due to the seeming inherent dangers it has in protecting oneself with spirits and demons beyond the mortal realm and into the Fade. The decisions Marrow makes are one part pride and belief in herself, one part spite, and two parts the need for her grief, her loss, to have meaning, which leads to a heartbreaking story to watch unfold, both from her perspective and by how little the people around her seemingly believe in her.
Many of the clan fear you will bring back the corruption. Or worse, from the mirror.
And where did they get that idea?
I am their keeper, Dalain. It was my duty to warn them. It's still not too late for you to return to us. Reconsider. There's no need for you to live alone.
Must we go over this again? You'll never accept what I'm doing.
The Eluvian is poison. It killed Tamlin. It stole Mahariel. It led you to blood magic. Will you let it twist you further from who you are?
And who am I?
Is it worth restoring this mirror if it turns your clan against you?
You know what it's like to lose everything, Hawk. Not just our land and freedom, but history, stories, language, magic, rituals. Even our gods are gone. It is a sacrifice, but if the mirror restores even one fragment of the past, it's worth it.
These three characters exist in a constant state of circular arguments, forever meant to never understand one another. Fenris hates Anders because he exemplifies what he thinks mages who want power are, and Anders hates Fenris because his inability to see how mages are wronged outside of Tevinter lights this deep-seated anger in him. And both hate Meryl for delving into blood magic, one because he sees her actions as the same monstrous ones as in Tevinter, and the other because a certain level of hubris combined with an inability to self-reflect in a healthy way, leads to projecting his problems on her. Meryl bites back when challenged by either, but attempts a level of kindness that is not reciprocated by their cruelty. She's also just chillin'. Why is everyone so mean to Meryl? These arguments don't get resolved in the end, and they're always violent to the point of cruelty, which...
Did you ever think about killing yourself?
Yeah, these interactions are well beloved by some in the community, but they also go a little too far, in my opinion. But those aren't the only companions. There's also Isabella, another near figurehead of the series. She's a pirate captain washed ashore without her boat, proud of herself and unblinking in the face of who she is and how she defines herself. Both carefree in her nature, and commanding in how those she sails with see and follow her, not prone to accept anything but the respect her position calls for. This attitude follows her into her everyday life. She's selfish to a fault, and extremely slow to trust. She's now without a ship, incredibly dodgy about why exactly it was she was shipwrecked, and what she is looking so fervently for. But her stay in Kirkwall, and how she's forced to face the consequences of her actions, and how, despite them, she'll have friends at her side, offers perhaps the best character arc in the game.
I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me. I'm glad you walked in here all those years ago.
I was drawn in by the intoxicating aroma of stale piss and vomit.
They say in Lomerin that a true friend is as constant as the Northern Star. Never put much stock in that saying till now.
There's also Aveline, a woman at your side from the very beginning, fleeing for Eldon and the Blight, but also the memory of her husband, whom she lost in her last moments before encountering safety, haunted by the weight of how his life had to end. Her military experience and need for a new goal in life leads her to the city guard, and eventually causes her to ascend to the captain of the guard. She is staunch in her beliefs, and an even stauncher friend and ally, but she's also prone to favoritism and protecting her own, and that both helps her guard become a unifying force, while also bringing the worst out of any standing state-ran peacekeeping organization, a huge flaw that hurts others more than once. But she's sincere and she means well, a loyal ally to Hawke, and also offers the most stirring and emotionally heavy conversation in the series for me.
My father trained me in all the skills he had been forced to give up. He spent everything to get me into Kaelin's service. Do you know what I remember? When he read to me, stupid things, dragons and heroes. He wouldn't turn a page until I reached over and took his hand. That big man made every step of the story my choice. I loved that. He died of the wasting in a Denerim ward. Those last weeks, I read to him. I had to take his hand to turn the pages, and I couldn't tell if he was too weak, or if it was the old game. He smiled at that, at his big girl.
There's also Sebastian. He's the most underwritten character in the series, he's a DLC character, and he changes the entire decision-making process at the end of the game. He's pretty bland and bad. I'm sorry, Sebastian girlies, but we all know it's true. There's also another dog. He's the best boy, and he's the very best home intruder alert in all of Thedas. That leaves us with Carver and Bethany, both twin siblings to the main protagonist, one of which will accompany you at times during the game, while the other passes on very early in the game. Both serve what this game is allowed to do best, which is make this story about Hawke as a character. While much of this game is about the politics of Kirkwall, the heart of it is about Hawke and their family, their dynamics and disagreements, their history, and the strife they face both as family of former nobles and also copperless and desperate refugees, their ascent in Kirkwall civilization, and all that ascent robs them of. Each member of the Hawke family is well framed within the narrative, taking advantage of the game's inability to offer the player multiple races to make a very solidified character and family dynamic. The inclusion of the Mass Effect dialogue wheel also allows for 3 iterations of the character to verbally play off and banter based on the 3 basic options it offers. Also, this game is funny.
This is important. Don't interrupt with your selfish prattle.
Get off your high horse. I have problems too.
Ha! What drink should I order, and who's the father?
Oh, you little...
Are there any good seats left? Look at these guards. I doubt either of them has to worry about having pretty children. His blood smells worse than the Wyvern's. Best keep it where it is. Muzzle the geezer. Got it.
I would never say that.
Mekkel is dead. That bitch killed him.
What's a Mekkel?
My brother!
Should I turn around now to let you stab me in the back, or would you rather it be a surprise?
You are just the sweetest.
How did you escape your dastardly kidnapper? Kick to the groin? Sand in the eyes? Rock to the head?
I paid good coin to be the one who wins this contest. It was my turn!
Oh, I didn't realize the Duke was offering charity to his more useless guests. My mistake. Someday I'd like to go 1 week without meeting an insane mage. Just 1 week. So I shouldn't slit my wrists and dance naked under the moonlight just to fit in?
If that's what you intend, perhaps I'll join you after all.
Just so you're aware, I have no idea what you're talking about. But feel free to keep rambling. Maybe we could steal dessert spoons and start tunneling under the wall. Have you ever seen an abomination? They are ugly.
I like big boats, I cannot lie. And you'll need to get creative. Call me names, even hit me.
I'm worried about you. You're enjoying this a little too much.
I am, aren't I?
I've been stung by a bee. I think it's swelling. Maker, am I dying?
The swelling is almost as big as your head. Don't just stand there, man. Do something before it's too late. If I die, make sure the world knows. I died at Shadowhane!
All of these factors combine into a very well-established character that is easy to get behind, that fits into the shapes of the family dynamic, that weaves in and out of the story of the characters well, and that makes Hawke a perfect vessel through which the greater story of Kirkwall can be told. Dragon Age 2 is a tragedy, told through the lens of the troubles of an immigrant family through all that they've lost and all that they can't escape, with an overbearing, corrupt city on the brink of collapse, placing pressures on them and their allies until something inevitably cracks. It's these reasons why this game is so well remembered so many years later. If you look at fan forums on Tumblr or Reddit or anywhere on the internet, you'll find a huge amount of people who say that Dragon Age 2 was the best game in the series, that its solo focus on the group of companions and its limited scope is a series highlight, that it's a very focused game that doesn't allow for the story contrivances or plot holes that often plague bigger, earth-shattering, massive scope fantasy stories. It's hard to argue against the idea that its limited scope really helped the overall story of the game, as it did allow for a far more personal and realistic journey that could linger on the politics of Thedas, one of the series' greatest strengths. There's plenty of reason why the game is retroactively beloved by those that played it without the context of its release, and it's understandable that such a huge portion of the fanbase now counts it as their favorite. All of these positives, however, come with a pretty glaring negative as a consequence of this being a sequel to a very choice-heavy, free-feeling, large-scope game. These good traits are fantastic both in the context of the game itself and in the greater context of the game's development, but it doesn't only exist within that context. The amount of things that had to be sacrificed to make the game happen are, to many, and myself included, not necessarily worth what was lost. This is apparent in that positive that we spoke of with the Hawke family. Yes, it's wonderful that you can get invested in the story of the character they've built, but it is the character Bioware built for you, with a very narrow amount of space for you to build your own character within that. Now, some players thrive creatively within that amount of context, but many actually want the space for them to build at least some of it themselves in an RPG, and that's not something DA2 really offers. And that's a problem because it's something the rest of the series does offer. The lack of other races hurts this aspect, as does the limited and slightly shoehorned addition of the Mass Effect dialogue wheel. The Mass Effect dialogue wheel works fantastic in Mass Effect, and I'd contend it would work great for any other Bioware game. But the complexity of emotional reaction is a huge part of what makes Dragon Age its own thing, and that dialogue wheel comes with the specter of a more rigid, morality-based system. It also carries with it an ever-present issue of dialogue on the wheel not necessarily fully matching the dialogue the character says. When you combine these limited character options with a limited and sometimes claustrophobic game, it can be easily felt why so many were disappointed. It is, inarguably, a step down in terms of scope and vastness of choice from its previous entry, and that didn't sit well with many players. And personally, its strengths still do not outweigh that weakness for me. And it's important that I point out here, now, why this is a frustration for me with Dragon Age 2 specifically. Especially when part of the thesis of this video is how Dragon Age is constantly a changing commodity. It is frustrating that I don't like this game as much as the rest of the community has grown to love it. And I love it, I do, but I just don't love it like others do. It's almost a strange experience to see how beloved it is now, having been there when this all began. And it's also odd that I can't just put it all aside, because I've been on record multiple times that if a game is good narratively, I'll likely enjoy it despite its issues. But Dragon Age 2, despite being the gem of narrative storytelling for the series, is different to me. And hilariously, the reason for that is that it just wasn't Dragon Age. And I recognize that point can almost come off as comedic when you see the name of this project and the pure length of it. It can easily be seen as contradictory, but it isn't for one specific reason. In a series that constantly changes, Dragon Age 2 was the first time it changed. and after it changed, it never stopped changing. With time, I became more forgiving of that constant change, mostly because of DA2 and my strong reaction to it and what it took out. Dragon Age 2 was a perfect example of how this constant corporate change could still bring beauty to Dragon Age's art. So as the series continued to change, I could accept this as a quirk of the series. Since constant change was the series, change would not be why I disliked the Dragon Age game, so Inquisition and Veilguard became easier. Palatable, even, because through the lens of Dragon Age 2, I knew beautiful art could be made despite this constant change. But it still remained the game I had the strangest relationship with. This was the game that chose to be different first, and not only did it dare to be different, it dared to be different by taking away the role-playing aspects I adored most about the original game. It limited everything I loved about the first game in such a way that I will never love it with a full and open heart, the way others rightfully do. In a series about character, in a game most especially about character, it took away the ability for me to create my own character, and limited what that character they offered me was able to do. With the benefit of hindsight and the gift of a wisdom I didn't have at 19, I am able to not only forgive Dragon Age 2 for this misstep, but love it for what it is, and be gobsmacked at the quality of what the team was able to pull off under such constrained and overworked conditions. But it is undoubtedly where the series' troubled, never-ending, ever-shifting historic issues began. There will always be a part of me, even after all of these years, even after coming to appreciate this game so much, that gets 30 hours deep into the game and starts to feel constrained, that wonders where the series would be now if this entry remained a standalone expansion for Origins. But that part of me is quickly quelled by what was accomplished, and how meaningful those accomplishments were to so many. And while a lot of this video is coming to understand that and giving the series grace, for me at least, the first one is the hardest to grapple with, because it set precedent. Another deeply controversial aspect of the game was the gameplay. DA2 opts for a far more action-oriented style of combat, maintaining the ability to switch between party members and still allowing for a certain amount of pausing. However, the tactical micromanaging of the first game is no longer there. This was a much maligned decision that I think chased off the many Origins-only Dragon Age fans, because the tactical control of combat in DAO was a feature that specifically sold the original game to consumers. You have to remember the context. DAO was meant to be a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate, and this was certainly no longer that. More hardcore CRPG fans took this perhaps worse than any of the other changes, as Bioware made a game specifically to rebirth a lost franchise's feel and then immediately moved away from it. The problem is that choice was not made in a vacuum. As we mentioned previously, Dragon Age Origins console port was what paved the way for the rest of the series. DAO on console was wildly thought to be a far worse game. However, that hardly mattered considering so much of Bioware's stock was now in the console market. Dragon Age 2 might be a wildly different pace than the previous game, it might lack all the tactical, heavily controlled combat of Origins on PC, but it isn't very far from the original combat of DAO on console. DA2, I would contend, might be a reduction of what Origins was on PC, but it plays like an evolution of what Origins was on console. As someone who has a large appreciation for everything Origins on PC was, how deep and tactical it was, and how it kept the CRPG alive in an era where it was far less popular than it once was, but also as someone who played the console version primarily, I will say that this was a huge upgrade for me. I don't think it's said enough that DA2 is likely the best combat system of the series in terms of moment-to-moment gameplay, if you of course discount the very tactical combat of Origins as the proper lineage of the series. The real-time ability to chain together massive area of effect attacks is a huge highlight for me, and is something that's not restricted to just mages as one might expect. The subclasses, I feel, offer a level of variation not matched in any of the other games. Being able to slow down enemies or freeze them in place entirely, and then set up multiple layers of fire, electricity, and arrows they now can't get away from, is a highlight of combat for the entire series for me, and maybe the most fun I had with all of the games. That opinion is a hot take, and highly debatable depending on what you value in a Dragon Age game and where you played them. But I do think it highlights this dichotomy between console players and PC players that plagues both the first two entries of the game, as well as the unified direction of the series going forward. The fan reception to that change, however, was heavily noted and accounted for as the team wrapped up the last of their DLC for the game. With the crunch of DA2 out of the way, the team was able to refocus and reevaluate the game that had been pitched in those original meetings during Origins, Dragon Age Inquisition. That sequel, however, was finally hitting store shelves in a landscape vastly different than its modest first conversations. At the end of 2011, 9 months after the release of DA2, a new game release was about to hit the gaming landscape, and its impact would be felt across the rest of gaming history.
But there's one they fear. In their tongue, he's Dovahkiin, Dragonborn.
It's hard to overstate just how much of a culture shock Skyrim was. I know I personally went to one of maybe 3 midnight releases I've ever gone to in my life for Skyrim, and the line was out the door and filled with people cosplaying. At the time, the fanfare took me by surprise, as the previous 2 games had felt somewhat niche. But I watched as the world took to this particular, far more aesthetically unified giant open world game like perhaps no other game I have ever seen in my entire life. That release was a moment in time that might never be duplicated. The success of Skyrim rippled through every single corner of the gaming industry, and that was both a boon and a curse for the genre. Any fantasy or fantasy-esque game early enough in development that could afford to shift to a more open-world format in order to replicate that success did. Games that generally had a very specific kind of structure shifted to open world because they knew it would sell with the player base that loved Skyrim so much. And generally, at least in those first few years, they were right. Inquisition's success is a perfect example of how Skyrim's success opened the doors for the entire genre, as it would go on to be the best-selling game in the history of Bioware as a company. I'd like to lead this section with my criticisms of the game, not because I think the game is bad, in fact, I think it's my second favorite in the entire series, but instead because I feel it's a deeply flawed game that has strengths I'll get to later that outshines those weaknesses, even if those weaknesses are glaring. The first, and easily most maligned mistake, is the open-world structure of the game. Inquisition is built around 10 open-world hubs, with one additional high-level DLC hub being added through Jaws of Hakon. There are other areas in the game, including one dedicated city, the home base and Skyhold, multiple more traditional, linear RPG-designed areas, largely in the DLCs, and various other smaller areas for singular quests or rewards. The vast majority of the time you'll spend in Inquisition will be in these open-world hubs, and some of them are absolutely gorgeous to look at and explore. Many who recount Inquisition as their favorite game in the series mention that its open world feels more like cozy gaming than it does a more proper RPG, being able to explore and look at the environment being a draw and not a negative. To that point, the backbone of every explorable area is the settling of places to camp, the finding of landmarks, and the extinguishing of fade rifts, and all of these do serve the purpose of having you explore, encouraging you to take in all of the stunning environments. The game does encourage this cozy, explorative feeling, so it's no wonder so many consider it such a huge positive. I can understand that perspective, but I don't necessarily personally agree with it. One aspect that's huge to Dragon Age that we haven't covered yet is the world state. When Origins was in development, Mass Effect was already working on a second game, and it was becoming clear that the series would have an interconnected story that plays off decisions you've made in past games. This has been very slightly experimented with in the past, but never to that extent. Bioware rightfully recognized that a lot of their current stock and brand identity existed within that every choice can come back to impact you mindset, and applied this to Dragon Age 2. When Inquisition came along, it was the first time that this thought process was challenged, as large portions of the player base were going to be playing on consoles that couldn't connect to previous games. Thus was born Dragon Age Keep, a secondary website where you can input many of your previous decisions and then transfer them into the game. This system was deeply inelegant. However, it served the basic function of carrying everything over. What it also unfortunately did was place an undue assumption under the player base. Everything you do in-game can later impact the story. Mass Effect 3 was the company's last launch, and several very minor choices and even some collectathon side quests from previous entries were rewarded in the final game. There was an unrealistic expectation that such design decisions created, causing even people who rarely finish games 100% to attempt to do anything and everything in each Dragon Age game, just in case it came up again. That perhaps was a wrongful expectation, but regardless, it was one that was specifically fostered by Dragon Age and Bioware as a whole. That mindset could not easily survive contact with a game like Inquisition. When you combine this mindset with the open-world areas of Inquisition, it's destined to be a slog. That would be fine if the quality of these side quests were high or even moderately interesting, but that isn't always the case. Many are fetch quests, which are not inherently bad if you can find a way to make them interesting or at least offer a reward valuable enough to do them, but that rarely happens in Inquisition, if at all. There's also obviously the go there, kill this quest trope, which again isn't an inherently bad thing. I would say the quality of these tend to be a bit higher, but that's less built off of good writing and more off the backbone of how strong Thetis' world building is. There are also larger quests, and the quality of these tend to vary. I would consider my two personal favorites to be the question of the abandoned mansion in the Emerald Graves, Château d'Yonterre. I have no idea if that's the right pronunciation. Please, for the love of God, help me. It's not outlined anywhere, and I don't know French. And the mystery of how time simply stopped working around one active rift in the Western approach. The first follows a haunted mansion you find through a note. Refugees who take up residence who clearly went mad in its presence until drastic action caused one to unknowingly jump off a cliff. Upon entering, the place grows more and more disturbed as you attempt to unravel the mystery of what happened to its original owners, all while endeavoring to find the source of what magic, demonic or Veil-oriented, that caused such horrid suffering in multiple families' lives. The second, meanwhile, takes place as you enter an old Tevinter ruin while chasing a new Tevinter threat in the Venatori, and finding that through their attempts to uncover the magic of the place, they have not only ripped open the veil, but also frozen time around them. As you attempt to investigate and uncover the mysteries behind such unknown magic going so very wrong, you slowly discover the series of rushed decisions and lust for glory that caused such a horrific halting of time itself. This sort of quality, however, is few and far between. I'd like to use an example I never see brought up, partially because it's bothered me for several years, and partially because I believe it to be an example of how much content the dev team was forced to make, and how that reflected quality. Crestwood is one of the more memorable areas of the game, as it changes based off your decisions while exploring the area. Its primary story involves a rift in the middle of its lake, one that is now pouring out demons that are attacking the local villagers. In order to get at the rift so that you can save the local villagers as well as pursue your own endeavors, you seek out the mayor of the town in the hopes that he can tell you how to get to the dam that would open the lake. Upon arrival, you realize that demons aren't the only issue, as undead have begun to fester somehow from within the lake and rise to try to take the town. The mayor seems dodgy on the subject, telling the party that during the Blight, the Darkspawn attacked the dam controls and flooded the old city, an act which killed many refugees. When he begrudgingly points you in the direction of the dam, you discover that it was not in fact attacked by the Darkspawn, but instead force closed by a human. When you go to explore the old town, you begin to pick up evidence that not all was as it seemed. This evidence indicates that someone trusted was responsible for the closing of the dam. When you return to confront the mayor, he has fled, leaving a note of admission that he flooded the old town and the refugees in it in order to quell his fear of an outbreak of the Blight. You can later track him down and bring him in for judgment for that decision. This is a fantastic story, and I'm particularly impressed with how the mayor is handled and how your position allows you to find him and hold him accountable. It is, however, not an original story, and I don't mean that as an insult to cliched writing, but instead because this idea has already largely been explored by Bioware, and in fact partially by the same team that created Inquisition. In Jade Empire, early in the game you arrive in a town known as Tian's Landing. The people here are suffering from the dammed down river suddenly shutting and leaving their river near barren. Older members of the community talk about how this reminds them of 18 years prior, right after a great drought, when the dam itself was built. With no explanation, one day it flooded the entirety of their home, forcing the survivors to escape uphill and rebuild. The survivors managed to rebuild Tian's Landing, but eventually they stopped talking about the flood entirely. The memories of what happened, those left behind, and what they had to do to survive, too horrifying to even speak of again. Prisoners considered too unimportant to save were left behind in flooded caverns and are now too angry to pass on. Children were abandoned in a flooded orphanage, scared and angry at the adults that seemingly loved them, failing them, and now they exist in a liminal space. A small child saved by a demon, trapped in an eternal war between two warring sides of morality, all because she was abandoned to die in the flood. And in the end, what you discover is that it's the Empire that caused this flood. I hesitate to call what was done here plagiarism, because it was done differently here, and it was likely either written by or approved by someone who worked on Jade Empire, considering so much of the Dragon Age lead team had still worked on that game. Now, I've seen others I respect in different fields such as music speak on the idea of self-plagiarism. However, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about judging someone who repurposes their own ideas. That seems not my place to judge. I also recognize changes were made to make it different enough, although I would contend that they weren't nearly enough. It does, however, bother me that Bioware's most successful game of all time borrowed this heavily from Jade Empire, which was their lowest selling game of the period and often referred to as the golden era of Bioware. But regardless of my opinion or anyone's opinion on those kind of topics, I do think this example is fairly emblematic of the larger issue with these open areas. Because they chose to make such a large world just to follow the trend of a massive open world, the quality of what populated it was greatly harmed. There are some fantastic experiences to be found, but the feeling you get is that some of it was just made to have content be present to justify the immense scope. And even when they're digging this deep for content, the world still feels empty. The issues were likely not helped by Inquisition's use of the Frostbite engine, a system that was never meant for RPGs. While many over the years have asked why it was necessary to move to Frostbite, it's worth considering that the old engine was seemingly aging out of use, and I think that other companies' overuse of an engine built on archaic technology proves that a radical change is sometimes necessary. With that being said, though...
Yes?
Yeah, maybe it was for the best to simply find another system. Frostbite is often criticized as a poor engine for Bioware to use, and I think that's true. But by all accounts, the use of another engine wasn't in the cards for Bioware, largely because Frostbite was an in-house EA engine. You work with what you have, and other options such as the Unreal Engine, as Mark Dara himself has confirmed, simply were not on the table. Of course, history has proven that Bioware's use of the Frostbite engine doesn't fit how they make games, a fact that isn't so much contested by Veilguard so much as proven, as Veilguard is the best game Bioware has ever made on the engine from a mechanical perspective, and in order to achieve that, Dragon Age's genre had to be changed entirely. Veilguard works in the engine not because of the 10 years Bioware has had to work on it, although I'm certain that helped in many aspects, but instead because Veilguard is a game that is more suitable to Frostbite. Veilguard in that way was a compromise. Inquisition is a really interesting moment in time for Bioware's relationship with Frostbite, however, as it's the best-selling game the company has ever produced, and despite my previous complaints, is a really great one as well. With how much Frostbite is maligned, its first outing was considerably better than those that would come from the rest of the 2010s. Now, granted, part of the reason Inquisition sold so well and received so many awards was because the next-generation consoles had so few games at the time, and 2014 had very few AAA game releases at all, but that doesn't defeat the massive success it was. That being said, there is a part of me that wonders how exactly it would have been reacted to today, because...
Something on?
Yeah, it had problems that aren't talked about enough. And yet, despite these many, many complaints, despite all of these issues, something about it works. Yes, the world is too big. Yes, the lack of content and the low quality control is glaring. Yes, the engine is not built for all of this. But it all still somehow fits neatly into the feeling of the game as a whole. Inquisition is not only a return to a greater feel with high stakes, it's also the story of an organization slowly growing larger and larger, garnering greater influence, becoming a power on the world stage. These open-world elements, the capturing of land in these far corners of Thedas, the solving of issues where people desperately need it, and even the use of the war table as a way of exacting all that growing wealth and influence, it all fits. Despite all of the imperfections, they do serve a greater overarching story. Inquisition might be plagued with a giant world and a scope it couldn't justify, but that scope and the slow creation of camps and capturing of forts serve as a physical embodiment of your Inquisition's growth on a grand scale. And I think, despite these complaints, its presence does add to the narrative in a tangible way that's difficult to pull off. These aspects would not work in any of the other Dragon Age games, but here specifically, it serves the greater themes of the game. I just also feel it could have been equally pulled off with half of the open world it offers. Bioware did take in fan feedback, and with Inquisition, tactical combat did return to the Dragon Age franchise. Inquisition also offers the first, and likely last, especially considering recent news, time in the series when the tactical map combat was offered on console as well as PC. This tactical combat, however, was a bit of a compromise, as it no longer offered a free camera and instead focused on a singular point, allowing you to scroll across a small area of the map outlined and make specific commands of your allies. I'm very glad this feature returned to the franchise, as I always felt there was very little reason to take the market you appealed to in the first game and move away from it. However, I didn't use this feature very much, if at all. This sentiment was also mirrored by much of the player base, as the stats that Bioware got in the wake of the game indicated that it was a very small margin of players that took advantage of the feature. Now, the argument could be made that this was because it was a half feature, a compromise that didn't work the way it did in Origins. However, when you couple this with the complicated history of console ports when it comes to the Dragon Age series, it becomes clear that there was always a certain part of the fanbase that cared very little for the more tactical, heavily controlled modes. It should therefore not be a surprise, even if it's a massive disappointment, that the series moved away from this. In BioWare's eyes, I'm sure they felt it was a production time saved by not making assets visible from every single direction possible. As it stands, I find Inquisition to be the combat I like the least. It's very slow and very heavy, and many of the higher level enemies feel like damage sponges. I will say I find the dragon fights to be the best aspect of combat in the game, which is interesting because it's the opposite problem that Dragon Age 2 had, where its boss fights tended to be a chore, whereas Inquisition's boss fights tend to be pretty great. It's interesting that Dragon Age 2's moment-to-moment combat tends to be maybe my favorite in the series, but Inquisition's combat tends to be my least favorite, and yet there's this chemistry of the boss fights being the exact opposite opinion. I'm not sure what causes that, maybe I'm just a bad gamer, but that's genuinely how I feel, and it's a very interesting thing. Dragon fights? Perfect. Outside of if the combat is objectively good, or objectively bad, or objectively easy, what is true, at least to all of my experience, is that it is the slowest. And I don't think the strange compromise of a tactical cam is enough to warrant that slowdown. Which is a bit of a problem because this is the game that you will spend the most time in when you're doing a series playthrough. The game's best aspects, however, are not in combat and exploration, but instead within roleplay, choice, story, and themes. For all that I've talked about the game's flaws, the successes vastly outweigh those aspects for me. This is somewhat of a warm take, but I'm a much bigger fan of the dialogue wheel in Inquisition compared to Dragon Age 2. In the place of that very limited good choice, sarcastic or neutral choice, bad choice dialogue wheel system brought over by Mass Effect, Inquisition opts to remove the symbols from the basic dialogue wheel entirely. This, in and of itself, doesn't fix the issue, but it's a step in the right direction toward decoupling the implications of the 3-set dialogue wheel setup. What is a huge improvement are the tone indicators and how they work within the dialogue wheel. Often when a character is either reflecting on how they feel on a subject or reacting to an especially shocking or emotionally charged moment, options with tone indicators such as stoic, sad, mad, confused, and anxious appear. These are much more useful when role-playing a character, as it adds emotional depth to who you're playing and tells you something about how they react to situations, and that puts the fully forming of your own character into your hands entirely. It's also hugely helpful that they've divided up these options along the dialogue wheel, often one in each corner, so as to entirely sidestep any implications from the more morality-based history of its dialogue wheel system. This makes for a far more effective system, especially in a game like Dragon Age where quality of roleplay and choice should be generally higher than its sci-fi contemporary with a more morality-based system. I do, however, feel this system does sometimes make the top, middle, bottom options feel a bit more bland and emotionless, an issue that worsens later in the series. There is a certain level of inflexibility that it offers, as a decision was made in Inquisition to minimize the amount of companions that can be dismissed or killed. However, when you look at the Jenga tower of decisions that have to be accounted for in each of these games, it's an understandable sacrifice to keep these things simplified. Despite this, the dialogue wheel, even with a tiny bit of the aggression and more extreme reactions being toned down, serves the game fantastically. A negative of how much better this dialogue wheel is, however, is that it's used mostly in side conversations. That in and of itself isn't bad at all, however these conversations tend to happen in an inelegant, non-cutscene, over-the-shoulder conversation system. This is how you'll spend most of your time finding out about your fellow characters, their history, and the world's lore throughout the game. The days of having individual conversations where you could ask questions within a cutscene format have been left behind, likely because creating assets for such a wide array of conversations takes time, and the price must balloon as you get into higher and higher graphic fidelities. This is an issue that started in Mass Effect 3, largely because of how short that game's own development was. However, in this case, it's far more likely this was due to having to build a game from the ground up in an entirely new engine. The unfortunate repercussion of this is one's ability to fully engage in some of the best writing in the game. The vast majority of times you'll be engaging in dialogue, it will be coming from someone whose face you can barely see, attempting to listen to their words and take in their emotional tone without being able to see their expressions, all while likely struggling with the camera to keep the two adequately in frame. This inevitably leads to somewhat of a disconnect from the scene, one that you can overcome. However, it's undeniable that it does a disservice to the quality of the writing when you're having trouble paying attention and emotionally investing in it because you can't see anyone's expressions. The good news is that the characters in this game make it worth overcoming this setback. Varric returns as a representation of what many would consider the inciting incident of the Mage Rebellion, beside the same woman who interrogated him during the events of the previous game. Cassandra, when you first meet her, is outwardly callous and aggressive, serving as the former right hand of the Divine and knowing her role is largely making the decisions no one else will, even if it upsets the more bureaucratic elements of the Chantry, Orlais, and everything beyond it. These initial impressions, however, are largely done under stress or, indeed, in interrogations she had to conduct. She is a woman dedicated to, and often, unfortunately, defined by, her role. As the story progresses, however, she takes a step back, partially because her radical action had already proven successful and the rest of the future of the Inquisition was now in more tactful hands, and partially because she's a woman of deep-seated faith. Her faith guides her through her every action, a moral core that she both follows and also struggles to abide by in the world. She is a practical woman living in a very practical world, forced to take her moral center of her religious beliefs and reconcile its positives and negatives with the realities of the organization she fostered and believes in, and its namesake's actual brutal history in Thedas. Perhaps that's why she quietly spends what little time she has outside of training indulging in more escapist fantasies, in tales of love and whimsy that she has so very little time for in her own life, things that she yearns for and yet doesn't fit her own image.
I want you to know, I have no regrets. Maybe if we'd found Hawke or the hero of Ferelden, the Maker wouldn't have needed to send you. But he did. You're not what I'd pictured. But if I've learned anything, it's that I know less than nothing.
There's also Sarah, who stands perhaps as the most misunderstood character in the entire franchise. Sarah is a rebellious figure, a young woman fresh from the horrors of growing up in a post-Blight Denerim, who has found herself in a secretive organization that can help those that grew up like her survive their day-to-day lives a little easier. A member of the Hidden Red Jennies, a group that acts less as an organization and more like a far-spread information circuit, the Jennies act in the best interests of the servants left under the boot of the noble systems of Thedas, doing their best to nudge and harass, intimidate, and eliminate nobles that might cause harm to those they employ, or sometimes own, and make their lives easier. This deep-seated belief in taking care of those under the heel of the nobility stems from Sarah's own past as the adopted daughter of a noblewoman, forced to face racism against elves that was largely encouraged by her cruel mother, who wished to control Sarah and her contact with the outside world and her heritage. The tragedy of this is that she succeeded, fostering within her a sense of self-hatred for her own people so deep it still bubbles out to the surface often, despite how her livelihood has largely been a huge help to the city elves who have had to live in similar circumstances. Sarah is caught in a constant tug-of-war between the world she wishes to protect and the world she denies, two related phenomena she can't connect within herself.
When you start going on about elves, it's hard to tell if it's about them or you.
Yes, you're ever so clever. Arse. And yes,
The shits who use them to make me feel broken can still eat it. But always waiting for that fight is way too much work. It's like doing half the hurt for them. Maybe we're old now, but I'm tired of it. We've new fights to look forward to. We always do, seems like.
Then we have Dorian. Dorian comes from the aristocracy of Tevinter, a land where mages, for all intents and purposes, rule. Tevinter is deemed, largely thanks to the Chantry, to be an aggressor, an evil in the world, due to its past imperialist rule of Thedas, and the discrimination the rest of Thedas has against people who can touch the Fade. This view of the nation isn't helped by how rampant its magisterium is with corruption and blood magic rituals, all of which Dorian deplores. Dorian journeyed southward in order to stop his old mentor from enacting upon the world theoretical magic they had created years ago, knowing it to be unstable, and through that process he watched as the most noble man he had ever known fell to all the same pitfalls and traps as the people he loathed. As a gay man in a country obsessed with creating perfect family lines as a way of creating a perfect mage, Dorian experienced horrors growing up that changed his view of his surroundings forever. However, he still maintains a love for Tevinter and what it could be. His pride and love for that home is often clouded with the cushy position he has there in terms of class, and as he grows, he's forced to come to the realization that idleness and lack of critical awareness of his country's failings is not the path forward.
Perhaps it's odd to say, but I think of you as a friend, Inquisitor. I have precious few friends. I didn't think to find one here. Don't speak. I detest confessions, and I'd like to get this over with. Allow me to say I'll stand beside you, against Corypheus, my countryman, or spurious rumor, so long as you'll have me.
Finally, there's Solus, another mascot character whose visage looms heavy over both this game and the series as a whole. Seemingly an elven mage that had managed to avoid both the roving Templars across the lands and his own people in the city elves in Dalish, Solus is a lover of the Fade, someone with a unique connection to the sleeping world and the spirits that exist within it. That love allows him to have a unique perspective on the world that is seemingly unmatched by any advisor you might meet, especially when that Fade knowledge has seemingly gifted him with an immense amount of knowledge of history, if perhaps divorced of some of the context of Thedas' more cultural aspects. This vast amount of knowledge can also make him rather prideful and standoffish if challenged or disagreed with. However, if you consider his words and ask plenty of questions, he soon begins to like and even respect you. All of this knowledge, all of this intellect, however, might mean he's far more than he lets on.
I would treasure the chance to be wrong once again, my friend.
But there's more than just those five. There's Cole, a spirit of compassion that has somehow physically manifested in the material world, struggling with the ramifications of what being a physical, material entity in a world of physical beings means, grappling with the traumatic events that put him there, and the realization that his path forward is a terrifying unknown to him. There's Iron Bull, a rather unlikely Kunari mercenary who admits freely upon first meeting him that he serves as a spy for the Antam, the military branch of the Qun. Iron Bull has served so long separated from the Qun that he has built a life outside of it, a self-image that naturally conflicts with how he was raised and who he was supposed to be, and that evolution, combined with his love and trust for his men, continues to cause friction in his life from without and within. There's Vivienne, a mage that has carefully built a life that allows her to leave the mage circles and serve in higher courts, taking the Arlesian history of wearing masks in high society and applying it in a more literal sense to how she faces the world, caught in a cycle of holding up the interests of the failing corrupt mage circles despite her best interests. She becomes a person that serves as a haunting and sorrowful example of how indoctrinated into belief systems someone can be when they're guarded as if and told they are a danger to the world from a very young age. Then we have Josephine, an advisor at your side as you make major decisions that might impact the world, the physical and metaphorical backbone of the organization, always swamped in the actual work that keeps the peace between the Inquisition, its surrounding nations, and the world together in horrifying times. Josephine is an advisor that likely could serve in the highest echelons of political machinations. However, she believes in nonviolence thanks to a young and foolish adventure in a way that wouldn't serve that office. And she's far too loyal to leave her friends and family behind to take such massive positions, especially her family, a large family that has a history of making bad decisions and mistakes that have made her the put-together, effective machine she is now. There's also Blackwall, a lone warden seemingly traveling for Reldon, recruiting those that might fight the Blight. He's seemingly upstanding and believes in his cause and the Inquisitions, not afraid to voice an opinion, and seemingly a good mentor to those he meets along the way, and even Sarah. But he's especially dodgy when talking about the Wardens as a whole, and his own past within them. It eventually becomes clear that he may be hiding something. This righteous persona, a mask for a far worse history. There's also Cullen, who...
Dear Cullenites, recently a small vocal mob of social justice warriors...
No, we're not doing that. No, not today. Maybe another day. Cullen's fine. I don't like Cullen. Cullen's fine. He has an arc. People like him. I don't. And even more so, I can't take him seriously ever since that video, so let's just move on. Maybe one day I'll talk about it, but let's just move on for now. Sorry, Cullen girlies. Earlier I mentioned the world state as a slight contradiction with how the game is laid out. However, I firmly believe it's also the game that best handles it. Each returning character and most decisions that are built off of past choices are handled largely with care. Time and effort was put into allowing characters to return, including Liliana, who serves as the Inquisition spy master. She's a more haggard character, serving as the left hand of the Divine for a number of years after the Blight, dealing with the grief of losing the person she saw as saving her life. This extension of Liliana's story makes her one of the best characters Bioware has ever made, in my opinion, as well as a central, front-running major character in the series, beside the likes of Varric and Morrigan and now Solus. There was a bit of pushback in bringing her back, as she can technically die in Origins. That is a fair criticism. If you make a choice in a previous game, it should be accounted for in future games. That said, that decision is the single most useless and nonsensical one Origins offers you. Hot take, but sometimes more choice is not the same as good choice, and in that one particular case, it was a bad choice. But I digress. That decision is also accounted for in Inquisition, creating one of the most fascinating unsolved mysteries Thedas has to offer, alongside Liliana becoming a fully fledged, multifaceted, fantastic character. Plus, a similar thing happens to Anders between Awakening and DA2, and that excuse is seemingly taken more seriously. And, I mean, if Ogren's allowed to come back in Awakening, despite the fact that you can brutally murder him in Origins, and he's allowed to just say, oh, I remember waking up after a massive bender with a splitting headache. You murdered me? Oh, that makes sense. Lol, I'm alive. You failed. I guess we can just move on and never acknowledge this again. If, that's the level of hand-waving that we're allowing in the first time that our decisions carry over into a new scenario, you can take my Spy Master Liliana from my cold, dead hands. Got it? Got it. Okay, I might have gotten a little fired up. I'm sorry. It's just... some things bother me a little bit. You're right to a certain extent. The decision should carry over, but moving on. Liliana isn't the only returning character with a major role to play. Alistair can return, with multiple variations based on his end in Origins, and can play a rather significant role in the story. Morrigan also returns, and has perhaps one of the best story arcs in the entire game, again depending on your own decisions. Hawke returns, and has their own stirring and appropriate character arc as a continuation of their pre-established character in the previous game. This particular return has garnered some backlash from the fandom, as some hard decisions are made on Hawke's outlook on things. However, I think as a whole, it's handled fairly well. For a character that was yours that now has to play a major role as an NPC. That's a hard thing to make work. In order to allow for such a huge moment to happen, I'm willing to look past some small, not necessarily fitting my canon thought processes that the character might have outside of my control. I think that's a fair trade-off, although if you don't personally feel that way, that's okay. I can see how it can break and burst similitude. Jumping off of that point, just as Kirkwall served as its own character in the second game, the third game uses the Inquisition, a radical upstart standing army with religious connotations, as a major driving character in the story. At the beginning of the game, you awaken with no memories, bruised and beaten, fingered for the death of the Divine after an explosion during peace talks holding the leadership of the Chantry, Mage Circles, and Templars. You don't remember the last few days of your life and are viewed as a criminal. But as it comes to light that you now have the power to close rifts that have opened across Thedas following the explosion, your journey becomes mythologized by the survivors, desperate and scared and looking for answers. Looking to you because you're the only one that seems able to help. Throughout the game, characters challenge the divine aspects of the rumors around your character, and you are forced to reckon with the implications of this chosen one narrative that has now been attached to you through the Andrastian faith. The Inquisition itself is a name for an organization that was built off the creation of the Mage Circle, an institution that is now in shambles that you have direct control of the fate of. Your character is allowed to question if the Inquisition in and of itself is a worthy namesake, and are forced to confront more damning information on what it was and how it being dissolved under the Chantry control hurt so many in the past, all leading up to a decision at the end of the final DLC that mirrors these choices. You are now in the place of history. It's up to you to decide if you need to follow in those footsteps or choose a new path. This kind of angle isn't exactly new to the series, as Origins also explores the ramifications of repeating history. However, with Origins, it's a side theme that also comes with a side DLC that is not the culmination of the game. Veilguard also explores these ramifications, however it's far more subtle in how it approaches it. Whereas the inherent corruption of a large military and religious organization is the primary theme of Inquisition. How you approach this issue is a huge part of who you make as a character and who they become. This is a level of cohesive depth that I don't think the rest of the series ever matches. The story of Inquisition is the battling of a forgotten foe with the power to tear apart and conquer the world, but the thematic elements of the game have very little to do with that villain, and far more to do with the uncomfortable histories of Thedas. Inquisition embraces the image of colonial and religious forces and puts you in the position to see as history begins to mythologize you outside of who you actually are, and they reinforce this by showing you exactly how that was done to the previous Inquisition, and how its legacy was damned by those that came after. It forces you to confront the unsteady, untrustworthy pen of history, and grapple with the fact that you will be more than you are. History will abuse and lie about your legacy if you let it. Inquisition is a game about power and image, and how both elements can be taken away or passed down and warped into something new, something different, something you might loathe with the turning of the pages of history. In that way, despite the many complaints I have about the world's size and scope and the lack of quality of content, it all fits that theme. You are bigger than yourself. Can you control what the world makes of you? Origins doesn't have this kind of thematic storytelling, and neither does Veilguard. Dragon Age 2 does, however it's of a much more personal nature. At its core, what I think I enjoy most about Dragon Age is the experience of making a tangible impact on the deeply fascinating world of Thedas, beside the friends and allies you meet along the way. So in my personal opinion, this is the epitome of an overall thematic approach. What Dragon Age Inquisition does here is special, and it's a feat I have not seen Bioware repeat. Inquisition has a mixed legacy. I, for one, am a large believer in it. I count it as fairly close to Origins in terms of quality for me. But it's hard to look past the failings it has by chasing the trend of open-world elements, without the ability to back up the many side quests with more interesting story arcs and rewards. Dragon Age Inquisition won Game of the Year in 2014. But as many have pointed out, 2014 was a barren year for major releases, so that win is slightly tainted. I personally think Inquisition rises high above that criticism, however, as I also believe some of that comes from the excellent addition of its DLC to even the story out and offer more of a satisfying conclusion than the base game offers. Now, if you believe a game should be complete upon release, you might have questions about this one, as I do feel the end falls a little flat without the additional content. I personally was recovering from major surgery when I played Inquisition, so I played it once, was not really in the right mindset to fully take it in, and then didn't play it again until 2020. That 2020 replay, however, made me adore the game. The addition of thematic elements to reinforce the backbone of the game in Joseph Hacken, alongside Trespasser, which is maybe the best DLC Bioware has ever made, and one that offered a far better ending than the base game had to offer, all of these things come together to create a final version of Inquisition that is far stronger than the base game. In some ways, I think the ending of Trespasser being the ending of Inquisition as a whole might have snakebitten anything that came after it. Inquisition would be the last Dragon Age game fans would receive for quite some time. Stories of Thetis would be explored in side comics and books. However, a severe drought came as a repercussion of the studio's rather public internal issues. Mass Effect Andromeda's major buggy release, along with Anthem's very public disastrous failing, would all combine to pull a major amount of attention away from Dragon Age 4's development. Bioware would make vague hints at the next game throughout this period, however it was becoming clear there was a very deeply troubled production happening behind the scenes. Rumors of stops and restarts leaked to the public on the project, some indicating the next Dragon Age game was yet another victim of the live service multiplayer game EA kept trying to wring out of the story-focused Edmonton studio. A repercussion of this was the team losing many of its major leads, burnt out by assisting with other projects, the lack of control of their single-player focused game's future, and likely a decade's worth of crunch culture. Unlike the previous games, we don't have an exhaustive third-party perspective on the development of this fourth game. There is no major lead like Mark Dara out there making comprehensive memories and lessons videos on a game this recent. And considering Dara was only brought back to oversee certain elements of the game's production in the last year as a part-time independent contractor, it's unlikely we'll ever see the behind-the-scenes of this tumultuous period in the development's history. At least not soon, but considering recent events, maybe we will, I don't know. But regardless, with all this in mind, the question becomes, during this period, with 3 extremely different games in the series out to the public, what exactly was Dragon Age at this point? You could likely very simply describe it as a choice-based RPG, and you wouldn't necessarily be incorrect in that descriptor, but I do think it ignores the basis of this entire video. Identity. We know the identity of what Pokemon is, or Ratchet & Clank, or Halo. There's unifying themes and design patterns that allow you to know what you're likely going to get when you boot up the game. Jak, the example we began with, doesn't have that. We start with a light fantasy open world platformer, and we move on to 2 games that are mission-based platform shooters with darker themes and semi-open worlds, and then settle on a racing game? I mean, to be fair, that just happened a lot in the PS1 and PS2 era, especially with Naughty Dog, but it being an important backbone to the story of the series complicates matters tremendously. Dragon Age has the same problem, so finding a unifying identity is difficult. So of what we have from the franchise, what combines them together? What are the elements that make the series a whole? What do you expect when you sit down with a Dragon Age game? Well, let's start with what we've covered. We've gone through the heavily inspired Baldur's Gate 90s style CRPG, then transitioned to a more action-based RPG, eventually settling on an amalgamation of the two. There's no unifying factor there. Next, we have a traditional linear-based RPG with a grand scope, that is followed by a very small linear-focused RPG, and then eventually a hub-world open RPG. There's no unifying factor to be found there either. With those eliminated, what do we have left? Well, the easy answer is the party factor. These games truly are built off the backbone of the companions. Their friendships, their relationships, the way you learn about them and help them along their path is part of the appeal. But we're talking about identity here, and that's not a unique identity because that's the basis of every RPG Bioware has ever made. That makes it no different than Baldur's Gate or KOTOR or Mass Effect. If we're to use that descriptor, Dragon Age would just be fantasy Mass Effect, and that's a reductive and redundant way to describe something. More than that, it fails to even approach identity, which is more than simplistic descriptors. It's more than gameplay. It's a combination of themes and returning elements. It's a recognizable world and structure. Well, if those game-like elements are eliminated, what about tone? Well, Origins was specifically built to be a dark fantasy. Its elements more resembled the late 2000s and early 2010s than the games that followed. Dragon Age 2 didn't hugely deviate from this, but instead adapted from the lessons of Origins' mistakes just enough to make it more palatable, if perhaps not perfect. But Inquisition is a huge swing outside the dark fantasy narrative, instead focusing more on high fantasy elements than either previous entry. Hope is a focus of Inquisition, something that arguably the previous two games lack. This makes the game more palatable than the arguably sometimes edgelord approach of Origins, but what it does not do is make it a unified vision of the series. Again, disparate threads. While this example isn't as harsh as the previous one, it's still decidedly different. Story structure is a bit more coherent. Both Origins and Inquisition feature an expansive world with a detailed plot focusing around various major and minor topics across Thedas. Both focus on multiple issues in order to bring together disparate factions, small and large, to unite behind a single cause. Both involve main characters that you can customize from varying levels of unique backgrounds. But here again, Dragon Age 2 breaks this formula. Dragon Age 2 does have a plot that feeds into the ultimate ending of the game, but those elements play out in the background before reaching their culmination, leaving the rest of the story to feel somewhat separate and certainly different than the united goal of the other two games. This variance, while explained by the crunch the team had to go under at the time, still makes the series not cohesively tied together. With all of that eliminated, what's left? What elements are unique to Dragon Age up to this point that differentiate it from other projects Bioware has made? Well, I think I've been able to pinpoint three loose ones. The first, and simplest, is its status as an RPG. While that's historically Bioware's niche, the atypical pure RPG is not something that the company has truly touched outside of Dragon Age in over 15 years. Mass Effect can obviously be described as an RPG, but its two sequels are only that on the strictest terms of choice-based mechanics, so Dragon Age is the last bastion of an old tradition, and its disappearance was not an accident. Secondly, I think another definition is twofold. The Keep and the series focus on switching perspectives for every game. The one thing you know when you pick up a Dragon Age game, without a singular doubt, is that you're going to be playing an entirely new character. Beyond this character, however, there's a greater world that sits behind them, informing its background by the choices you made in other chapters of the stories, present and visible but not the current focus. Carrying over decisions has become a staple of Bioware games specifically. It has kept them unique in a market that has evolved to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and even surpass them in some aspects. But Dragon Age's carryover system is one entirely unique to its series, and only resembles Mass Effect in name alone. Finally, and maybe most importantly, I'm very hesitant to point this out as I fear I will be either misunderstood or emboldening a talking point I think is often misrepresented in the upcoming topic, but I do feel it's a point that should still be made. So, this is a series built on politics. Thedas as a setting does not allow you to have a moderate or centrist view. Every single Dragon Age fan has a strong opinion on the political realities of the Dragon Age world, and each game's story forces you to interact with that. A huge part of the games is recognizing that political reality, reacting to it, and guiding it in the direction you want it to go. These are not background elements. You do not have the opportunity to disengage with these topics mentally, and these topics are not totally divorced from the political reality of our world. These topics, God knows, are not always handled well, but they are always, up to this point, a huge central pillar of the series' storytelling, specifically in how choice is presented to the player. What I hope becomes clear as I point these things out, what I hope I've made apparent in the last 2 hours. I started this project at the end of November. It's the end of April. What am I doing with my life? Okay, serious. What I hope I've expressed is that Dragon Age is a continually changing series, with very little to unite each of its entries, prone to overhead changes and calls by executives. So, now that we have that understanding, let's move on to the topic of the day and attempt to actually engage with the final entry of the series with a more demystified view of how we got here.